I don't remember the first time my son was ashamed of me. There were probably many small moments before I noticed them. A pause when someone asked what I did for a living, a quick change of subject when I mentioned the flower shop, the way Evan stopped bringing friends to the store after he left for college. I could name dozens of moments now. But I remember the last one. It happened on a warm October afternoon at a charity gala in downtown Los Angeles. My flower shop, Whitmore Flowers, had been hired to provide the arrangements for the entire event. More than 420 pieces had been ordered, from small table arrangements to tall displays at the entrance. I had prepared many of them myself. By the time I arrived at the venue, my hands smelled of eucalyptus and roses. I had been awake since 4 that morning, checking deliveries, replacing bruised petals, and making sure every ribbon was tied the way I had taught my staff. I was tired, but I was proud of the work. The ballroom looked beautiful. More importantly, the client was Evan's company, Whitmore and Vale Events. I had watched that company grow from a small idea into something people in the city actually knew. Evan was 39 now, successful, well-dressed, and always surrounded by people who seemed to know exactly what to say at expensive events. I found him near the entrance with his wife, Claire, and several guests. The moment Evan saw me, his expression changed. It was quick. So quick that another person might not have noticed. I did. He stepped away with Claire, and I continued checking the flowers, pretending I had not seen them. I was close enough to hear him speak. "Please don't introduce her as my mother. She's just the florist." Those words stayed with me. Not because I was ashamed of being a florist. I had owned my flower shop for 36 years. I had opened that little shop when Evan was 3 years old, and I had built my life around it. I was ashamed that my own son had learned to be ashamed of me. I set down the box I was carrying and adjusted a ribbon that did not need adjusting. Then I looked at my hands. They were the same hands that had tied thousands of bouquets, the same hands that had packed Evan's lunches when he was little. The same hands that had held his backpack on the first day of school because he was too nervous to carry it himself. A few minutes later, one of the event's main clients came over to inspect the arrangements. She complimented the flowers and asked how long I had owned the shop. She looked genuinely surprised and told me that 36 years was impressive. Before I could say anything else, Evan stepped in. "Mom, we have staff for this. You don't need to stay." He smiled when he said it, as if he were trying to make the dismissal sound like kindness. I nodded, told the client everything was ready, and finished my work. I did not confront Evan. I did not ask him why he had called me just the florist. I did not tell Claire what I had heard. I simply drove back to my shop. I drove slowly, with the radio turned low, while the city lights moved across the windshield. By then, the sun was low, and the street outside Whitmore Flowers was almost empty. I locked the front door, turned off the display lights, and sat behind the counter for a few minutes without doing anything. Then I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I had not looked inside for a long time. There was a photograph of Evan at 8 years old, missing one front tooth and grinning at the camera. There was his first college tuition receipt folded carefully in half. There was an old brass key from the first property I had ever bought. And underneath those things was a piece of lined paper. Evan had written on it when he was 8. The handwriting was uneven, the letters too large for the page. "Mom, one day I'll buy you a big house." I ran my thumb over the paper, then placed it back in the drawer. For most of my life, I had believed that a mother's job was to make sure her child never had to struggle the way she had. I had worked holidays, I had missed dinners, I had stayed late at the shop when Evan needed money for school, a car, a business, or simply another chance after something had gone wrong. I had told myself it was love. Maybe it was, but sitting alone in that flower shop that evening, I began to understand something I had spent years refusing to see. I had spent 36 years making sure my son never had to struggle, and for the first time, I wondered if that was my biggest mistake. I kept the drawer closed that night, but I could not close my mind to what I had heard at the gala. For the first time, I started looking backward, not at the money itself, but at all the moments when I had quietly stepped in to make Evan's problems disappear. When Evan was 17, his car broke down before an important school exam. He called me from the side of the road, frustrated and embarrassed. I closed the flower shop early, drove out to meet him, and paid for the repairs. At 21, he got into college and came home with a tuition bill far larger than anything I had saved for. I took extra wedding orders that summer, worked every weekend, and used money I had planned to keep for myself. I paid the tuition, Evan thanked me, and I told him not to worry about it. At 25, he decided to start his own event business. He had enthusiasm, a good eye for people, and almost no money. I gave him $40,000 from my savings. He looked relieved. I looked relieved too. I thought I was giving my son a beginning. I didn't realize how often a beginning can become a habit of being rescued. At 28, the business needed financing. The bank wanted collateral. Evan had very little to offer, so I put one of my properties behind the loan. I told myself that if the business succeeded, he would eventually stand on his own. At 31, I bought the first commercial building his company rented. I did not put his name on it. I simply became the landlord and gave him favorable terms. To Evan, it was another business expense. To me, it was another obstacle removed from his path. By 34, the numbers were larger and the requests came more easily. He had grown comfortable calling me when something went wrong, a delayed payment, a bad quarter, a new expansion, a lender asking difficult questions. Then came the phone call I still remember. I was standing behind the counter at Whitmore Flowers when Evan called. I held the phone between my shoulder and ear and kept working. "Mom, the bank wants another guarantee." I stopped cutting. I asked how much. He said it was about $900,000. $900,000. I looked at the roses in front of me. Their stems were wet, and drops of water had collected on the metal table. The number was so large it should have sounded impossible. Instead, I asked Diane to review the documents. A few days later, I signed. That was the last guarantee I gave without asking myself why. Diane had been my attorney for years, but she was also one of the few people who knew how much I had done for Evan. She came to the shop one afternoon when I was unpacking lilies. She placed the documents on my work table and looked at me. "Marianne, when does this end?" I knew what she meant. I looked down at the papers and gave her the answer I had used for years. "He's my son." Diane did not raise her voice. "That's not an answer." She was right, but at the time, I still believed it was. After my husband died, Evan was only 11. I became both parents overnight. I worked before sunrise and came home after dark. There were nights when he ate dinner without me because a wedding order had to be finished. There were school events I missed. There were evenings when he waited in the back room of the flower shop because I had nowhere else to take him. I never forthought those things. Neither did he. Once, when Evan was older, he told me that I worked all the time. He wasn't angry when he said it. That almost made it worse. I carried that sentence for years, so whenever Evan needed something, I gave it to him before he had to ask twice. I told myself it was love. Sometimes it was, but sometimes I was not helping him because he needed help.
I was helping him because I needed to believe I was still making up for the mother I thought I had failed to be. That was the part I had never admitted to myself. Evan thought I had helped him get started. He never saw the payments, guarantees, property, and quiet decisions underneath his success. He saw the flower shop. He saw his company. He did not see the floor between them. I had been holding it underneath him for years. Diane eventually brought me a thick folder. She had gathered 36 years of financial records, from the first tuition payment to the most recent guarantee. She placed it in front of me. I opened it. Page after page showed a version of my life I had never bothered to calculate. I did not need to read every number. I only needed to see the total. For a long time, I stared at it. Then I closed the folder. For the first time, I understood there was a difference between giving your child a chance and making sure he never has to earn another one. I looked at Diane and finally said, then maybe it's time he built one.
The week after I closed Diane's folder, I tried to return to my normal routine. I opened the shop before sunrise, unpacked fresh flowers, greeted customers, and answered the phone as though nothing had changed. But something inside me had changed. Once you finally admit a painful truth to yourself, you cannot unknow it. A few days later, Whitmore and Vail hosted another luxury charity showcase for donors and corporate clients. Whitmore Flowers had designed every arrangement for the event, so my invitation was practical rather than personal. Claire had already hinted that one of my employees could supervise the installation instead. I understood what she meant. She did not want me there. I went anyway. For 36 years, I had checked my own work before every important event. Flowers were delicate. One damaged bloom or one crooked ribbon could undo hours of careful preparation. I had never believed owning a business meant staying away from the work that built it. When I arrived, the ballroom was almost ready. Soft white roses covered the tables, tall lilies framed the entrance, candles reflected against polished glass, and every arrangement was exactly where it belonged. I quietly walked through the room, adjusting ribbons and replacing a few bruised petals. 12 centerpieces still needed one final inspection. That was when I heard familiar voices. Claire was standing with her mother, Judith, and two friends, Lauren and Vivian. They were talking about old money and self-made money, comparing families who inherited wealth with people who had built successful lives from nothing. Their conversations sounded pleasant, but every sentence carried the quiet competition that sometimes follows success. I was close enough to hear them without meaning to listen. Claire noticed me first. She leaned toward Judith and softly said, "Mom, you don't need to talk to her." Judith glanced at me and asked, "That's the florist?" Claire smiled before answering, "Unfortunately." I kept working. There are moments when defending your dignity means refusing to argue with people who have already decided how little you deserved. I straightened another arrangement and reminded myself that flowers never cared who received the credit for making a room beautiful. A few minutes later, Evan walked over. I asked whether everything looked ready for the evening. Instead of answering my question, he quietly told me I should leave. I reminded him that I still had 12 centerpieces left to inspect. His answer stayed with me. "Mom, this isn't your world." I looked around the ballroom. Every flower in that room had passed through my hands or the hands of people I had trained. Every wedding, fundraiser, and celebration I had supplied over 3 decades had taught me something about beauty, discipline, and service. If this was not my world, I wondered whose world he believed had built it. Before I could gather another thought, Claire joined us. She spoke calmly, almost kindly, which somehow made the words hurt even more. Evan worked too hard to become somebody. I looked at my son. He said nothing. That silence told me more than any explanation ever could. He did not defend me. He did not correct her. He simply allowed those words to remain between us. For years, I had mistaken his silence for discomfort. That evening, I finally understood it had become agreement. Claire reached into a portfolio and handed me a large envelope. She explained that I had often said the Pasadena townhouse would eventually belong to Evan. She spoke as though she were helping me complete paperwork I had simply forgotten. Inside the envelope were prepared property transfer documents. Not notes, not suggestions, a completed deed transferring ownership of my Pasadena townhouse. Every page had already been filled out. Only one signature was missing. Mine. I slowly read each page before placing the documents back inside the envelope. More than the papers themselves, what unsettled me was the assumption behind them. Someone had expected me to sign without asking questions, without taking the documents home, and without speaking to my attorney, as though saying yes had become my only role. I handed the envelope back. No. Evan sighed and quietly asked me not to make things difficult. I shook my head. I'm simply not signing away something that belongs to me. No one argued after that. Perhaps there was nothing left to say. I turned around, walked out of the ballroom, and left before the first guests arrived. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not look back. For the first time, walking away felt calmer than staying. I sat inside my car for a few minutes after closing the door. The city lights were beginning to appear, and people were arriving for an evening that would continue without me. Then I called Diane. When she answered, I said only 4 words: pull every guarantee. She was silent for several seconds before asking whether I was sure. I thought about every tuition payment, every property, every guarantee, every quiet rescue that had slowly convinced my son that my support would never end. Then I answered, for the first time in 36 years. I started the engine and drove home knowing that nothing had changed yet, and knowing everything had. The next morning, I opened Whitmore Flowers before sunrise, just as I had done for 36 years. Nothing looked different. That was almost comforting. I did not sit in the small office. I stayed at the work table and cut stems myself. My hands moved through the routine automatically, but my mind was somewhere else. The night before, I had told Diane to pull every guarantee. Now I had to decide what that actually meant. When the first rush of customers was over, I opened my laptop and began going through the accounts connected to Evan and his company. I did not make one dramatic decision. I went through everything line by line. I sent Diane instructions to prepare the notices ending my personal guarantees on Evan's outstanding obligations. I asked her to review every property being used as collateral and begin the legal process of removing my personal support where the agreements allowed it. Then I moved to the personal accounts. There were credit cards and other discretionary accounts I had allowed Evan and Claire to use over the years. Some had nothing to do with keeping the business alive. I authorized their cancellation. I also told Diane to terminate the vehicle lease registered under my name, according to the terms of the contract. Then came the business payments. I withdrew discretionary funding I had been providing to Whitmore and Vale and asked Diane to review every company-related payment I was still making. I was careful about one thing. I did not cut electricity. I did not cut water. I did not interfere with heat, payroll obligations, or anything essential simply because I was angry. I was not trying to make Evan suffer. I was separating what I owned and what I had voluntarily provided from what the company actually needed to operate. There was a difference between stopping support and causing damage. For years, I had blurred that difference. Now, I was paying attention.
The first consequences did not arrive all at once. Nothing collapsed in a single afternoon. Instead, small things began to stop working. One of the first was a credit card Claire had been using. She tried it at a restaurant, and the transaction was declined. She assumed it was a banking error. She tried again later. It still did not work. Eventually, she called Evan. I did not hear that conversation myself. Diane told me about it later. Claire was confused. Evan was irritated. Neither understood yet how many accounts had been connected to me. Claire said, "Evan, my card isn't working." He told her to call the bank. Then she reminded him that the account was his mother's. After that, there was silence. That silence was important. For years, my support had become part of the background of their lives, like electricity or water, something they expected to be there without asking who was paying for it. Now they were beginning to notice. The Range Rover was different. The lease was registered under my name. Evan was an authorized driver, but he was not the person legally responsible for the lease. I did not call the dealership or send an angry message to Evan. I did not try to create a scene. Diane handled the termination according to the lease agreement. There were procedures, there were notices, there were dates. A day later, the leasing company arrived. Claire was outside when they came. The agent did not announce anything about my finances. He did not tell the neighbors who paid for the vehicle or why the lease was ending. He simply explained that they were there to recover the vehicle listed under the lease account. That was all. The Range Rover was loaded and taken away. Claire stood still. Evan watched from nearby. There was no shouting or public humiliation, just a car leaving their driveway because the person responsible for its lease had decided not to continue paying for it. When Diane called me afterward, I was standing behind the counter arranging white roses. She told me the vehicle had been recovered. My first question surprised me. "Is Evan okay?" Diane paused before answering. Embarrassed. I looked down at the roses in my hands. Good. The word came out more sharply than I intended. Then I was quiet for a moment. I did not feel proud of what had happened or enjoy imagining my son standing there while his car was taken away. But I could not pretend that nothing had been learned. For years, Evan had been ashamed of the woman behind the flower counter. Now, for the first time, he was having to live without the invisible protection that woman had placed around him. And that was the part I needed to remember. I had not stopped loving my son. I had stopped paying for the life he was ashamed to admit came from me. And perhaps the hardest truth was that I did not want him hurt. I wanted him awake, because maybe embarrassment was the first honest thing he had felt in years.
The next few days were quieter than I expected. Whitmore flowers continued opening before sunrise, and I went back to my routine. But while I was trimming stems and checking orders, Whitmore and Vale was beginning to face a problem it could no longer postpone. The bank wanted additional collateral, updated personal guarantees, and a full financial review before renewing or extending several of the company's credit facilities. This time, the bank was asking questions he could not answer without looking beyond the company. That was when he discovered something he had never fully understood. The largest loan supporting Whitmore and Vale was secured by property that belonged to me, not the company, me. Evan knew I owned real estate and had helped the business. He did not know how deeply those things were connected. He had mistaken my support for a collection of favors. He was beginning to see that it was the structure underneath his company. Diane kept me informed, but I wanted Evan to deal with the bank himself. Then my phone rang. It was Evan. Usually there was a text first or a request passed through an assistant. This time he called directly. His voice sounded tired. "Mom, I need you." I paused. I asked, "What do you need?" He told me the bank needed my signature. I already knew what that meant. They needed another guarantee.
I asked what the guarantee was for. For the bank. For years, that would have been enough. This time, it wasn't. I told him I could not do that anymore. He became angry because I had finally refused to play the role he expected me to play. He reminded me that I was his mother. I told him yes. Then he asked me to help him. I answered with the only truth I had left. I already did. After we hung up, I stayed behind the counter for a long time. I knew the conversation had hurt him too, but there was something different about this moment. I was no longer being asked to help Evan build something. I was being asked to protect a business that had never learned how to stand without me. Evan did what I expected him to do next. He looked for another way out. He began searching for a new investor. For the first time, I think he genuinely believed he could solve the problem without his mother. Part of me wanted him to succeed. If he could find outside capital and take responsibility for the company, perhaps that would be the independence I had wanted for him. He found an investor willing to discuss a preliminary deal. The numbers looked promising. Then the investor's lawyers reviewed the company's records. That was when another problem surfaced. Whitmore and Vale did not own the building where its headquarters were located. It leased it. Evan had never questioned who owned the landlord company. The property was held through an LLC. He assumed the LLC belonged to Whitmore and Vale, or at least to one of the business entities connected to it. It didn't. The ownership records led to Whitmore Family Holdings, and Whitmore Family Holdings was controlled by me. Evan had been running his company from a building he had never owned, under a lease he had never realized was ultimately tied to his mother. It changed the negotiation completely. The investor was now looking at how much of the company's stability depended on assets and guarantees Evan did not control. Around the same time, another piece of the past came back to the surface. Judith Bell was reviewing her own financial records because of the new scrutiny surrounding Whitmore and Vale and the people connected to it. She found an emergency business loan from 6 years earlier, $175,000. She remembered receiving the money when her interior design company was close to failing. At the time, she had believed the funds came from an anonymous private investor. She had never known who had provided them. Now, the bank records gave her a name, Whitmore Family Trust. She asked the banker who stood behind it. The answer was simple: me. Judith had no idea. I did not need to know what she would do with that information. For the first time, pieces of my hidden support were connecting in front of people who had never asked where they came from. That evening, Diane called me at the flower shop. She told me the investor meeting had been scheduled for the following day. Diane asked whether I understood what they expected. I did. They thought they were meeting the woman who owned a flower shop. I looked around Whitmore Flowers at the buckets, ribbons, invoices, and flowers waiting for morning deliveries. Then I thought about the building where that meeting would take place. I told Diane they were about to meet the woman who owned the building they were sitting in.
The next morning, I drove downtown before the meeting began. The conference room was on an upper floor in downtown Los Angeles. Evan had arranged the meeting with the new investor, hoping outside money could solve the problem the bank had uncovered. Claire was there. Judith was there. Several board members had joined them, along with the investor and his advisors. They expected to meet a private investor who might put enough money into Whitmore and Vale to keep the company moving. They were not expecting me. I arrived with Diane. I was wearing a simple blouse, a cardigan, low shoes, and the old leather bag I had carried for years. Nothing about me suggested I was walking into a meeting that could change the way Evan understood his entire business. When I opened the door, Evan looked up. For a moment, he simply stared at me. "Mom?" I took a seat. Diane placed her briefcase beside me.
No one needed a dramatic entrance. The room was already quiet enough. Diane opened the first folder. The first document was the lease for Whitmore and Vale's headquarters. Diane explained that the headquarters were owned by Whitmore Commercial, LLC. Evan recognized the name. It was the landlord he had been paying rent to for years. To him, it was simply another company on another contract. Then Diane explained who owned that landlord. Me. The room went quiet. Evan looked from the document to me as if the answer might change if he looked long enough. It did not. The headquarters where he had built his company were sitting on property I owned. Diane moved to the next document. The warehouse was also owned by me. The property had supported the company's operations for years. Evan had treated it as another business expense. He had never stopped to ask why the terms were so favorable or why the ownership structure was more complicated than it seemed. Then came the company's original equipment financing. A large portion of that financing had been paid by me over the years through decisions made when Evan was still trying to build the business. Then came the personal guarantees. The guarantees the bank had recently demanded again were not new. I had been the person standing behind them. If the company could not meet an obligation, my property and my credit were part of its safety net. Evan knew I had signed documents for him. He had never understood what those signatures meant. Diane turned another page and reached the family trust. Diane explained that I was the controlling trustee. The room grew more uncomfortable, but the biggest document was still in the folder: Whitmore Family Holdings. The ownership records were clear. The holding company controlled 68% of Whitmore and Vale. 68%. Not a small investment, not a loan, a controlling interest. The company Evan believed he had built independently had been operating for years, with me underneath a large part of its financial foundation. I watched him read the document. His face changed slowly. There was no anger at first, just disbelief. Then he looked at me. "You never told me." I let the silence sit for a moment. "You never asked." I did not say it to punish him. I said it because it was true. People saw a small flower shop and an older woman behind a counter. They never saw the properties, the trust, or the years of reinvesting profits instead of spending them. And Evan had never asked. Then Diane opened one final folder. This one concerned Bell Interiors, Judith's company. Inside was the record of the $175,000 emergency loan made 6 years earlier, when Judith's business had been close to failing. Judith always believed the money came from an anonymous private investor. Now she understood that the funding had come from me. I looked toward her, and for the first time since I entered the room, she seemed less like someone evaluating a business deal and more like someone reconsidering every conversation she had ever had with me. I had never given Judith that money so she would owe me gratitude. I had given it because her company was in trouble, and I had the ability to help. That was the difference between what I had done and what they now imagined. I had not built all of this to control Evan. I built it because I wanted my son to have a head start, a better chance than I had been given, a safer path, a little more room to make mistakes. But somewhere along the way, the head start became a permanent cushion, and I finally understood what that had done to him. I looked at Evan and told him the truth I had avoided for years. "I didn't build this to control you. I built it because I wanted you to have a head start. But I gave you a head start so long that you forgot to walk." After that, I said nothing. There was nothing else I needed to explain. The conference room emptied slowly. There were documents to sign,
questions to answer, and decisions that could no longer be postponed. For the first time, Evan had to sit across from professionals who were not there to solve his problems for him. Diane and the other advisors worked through the next steps carefully. Whitmore and Vale would not be shut down. I had no interest in destroying the company, and I did not want its employees to suffer because of decisions Evan and I had made over the years. The business was still viable. It had clients. It had experienced employees. It had a reputation. What it did not have anymore was an endless supply of my protection. The company was restructured. Evan lost control of the business, and professional management was brought in to oversee its operations. The outstanding debt was restructured, so the company could continue under terms it could actually support. I protected the properties, trusts, and assets I had spent 36 years building. I did not take the company away simply because I could. I did not empty its accounts. I did not sell the business out from underneath Evan. I stepped back from the role I had been playing. That difference mattered to me. For years, I had confused helping Evan with carrying him. Now I was finally learning that those were not the same thing. The changes in his personal life came more quickly. The luxury apartment was gone. So were the expensive leases and the credit cards that had once seemed almost unlimited. My guarantees were gone too, which meant Evan could no longer borrow against the security I had spent decades building. The social life disappeared more quietly. There were fewer invitations, fewer dinners at expensive restaurants, fewer people interested in being close to him when there was no longer a company lifestyle attached to his name. I heard about some of it through Diane, but I never asked for details. Claire was different. She had built her life around the version of Evan who appeared successful from the outside. Once that version began to disappear, the distance between them became harder to hide. One evening, she told him, "I didn't marry this." Evan answered, "You married the life." She did not respond. I never asked Diane what happened after that conversation. Evan moved into a much smaller apartment. For the first time, the lease had his name on it because he was responsible for paying it. He bought his own groceries. He learned how much ordinary things cost when nobody else was quietly covering them. He had to think about rent before restaurants. He had to look at his bank balance before making plans. He had to decide what he could afford instead of assuming someone would make the difference disappear. None of those things were punishments. They were ordinary parts of adulthood. That was what I wanted him to understand. I did not follow him. I did not ask where he lived or whether he was struggling. I went back to Whitmore Flowers. The shop was the one place where I knew exactly what was expected of me. Flowers arrived early. Orders had deadlines. Stems had to be cut. Customers had to be called back. There was comfort in work that did not care about status. One afternoon, Diane came by while I was arranging a delivery. She asked if I wanted to know how Evan was doing. I told her no, not because I had stopped caring, because I knew that if I kept checking on him, I might start rescuing him again. I told her that if Evan wanted me to know how he was doing, he would tell me himself. Then I went back to my flowers. For several weeks, nothing happened. Then one morning, just after the shop opened, I heard the bell above the front door. I looked up. Evan was standing there. He was not dressed for a client meeting. He carried no briefcase, no folder. He looked tired, but different. There was no anger in his face. There was no expectation that I would fix something. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for the townhouse. He did not ask me to restore his position at Whitmore and Vale. He simply stood there, looking around the shop he had once been embarrassed to be associated with. Then he told me he needed a job. I reminded him that I did not have a CEO position for him. He said he knew. Then I asked what he wanted. His answer was simple. "I want to learn how you did it." I looked at my son for a long moment. For 36 years, I had tried to give him answers before he learned how to ask the questions. Now, for the first time, he had come to me without asking for an answer.
He was asking for a chance to learn, and I knew that was the first thing I had seen in him that morning that money could not buy.
The next morning, I did not make Evan a promise. I made him fill out an application. I took a blank employment form from the office and placed it on the counter. I did not offer him money or a position that matched the life he had been living. If he wanted to work at Whitmore Flowers, he would have to apply like anyone else. He looked at the paper before asking, "You're serious?" Completely. That was all I said. His first morning began at 5:45. I was already at the shop when he arrived. He wore ordinary clothes, no suit, no expensive watch, nothing that announced who he had been or what he had once believed he was entitled to. I gave him the same work I gave every new employee. He unloaded flower boxes, cleaned the buckets, swept the floor, carried water, delivered arrangements, answered the phone, and learned our inventory. I did not give him easier work because he was my son. I did not introduce him to customers as the former CEO of a luxury event company. I did not tell anyone he was the owner's son. One morning, a customer who had never met him asked if he was new. Evan simply said, "Yes." Then he went back to work. For the first few weeks, I watched without saying much. He began noticing things he had never needed to notice before. He learned that one damaged arrangement meant money lost. A late delivery could cost a customer's trust. A customer who stopped trusting you might never return. He learned that employees remembered how they were treated. Someone who felt ignored could leave. Someone who felt respected might stay for years. He also learned that small expenses were still expenses. Boxes cost money, fuel cost money, replacement flowers cost money. A small unpaid invoice did not disappear because a business had once been successful. I never gave him a lecture about those things. He learned them by doing the work. That was the lesson I had failed to teach him when I kept solving problems before he had the chance to face them. After a month, I noticed that Evan no longer talked about business in terms of titles. He asked about suppliers and margins. He paid attention to inventory. He began to understand that a business was not simply an office, a company name, or a position at the top. It was hundreds of ordinary decisions made correctly when nobody was watching. One afternoon near closing time, Evan came over while I was arranging roses. He was holding a small envelope. He told me it was his first month's savings. I asked why he was giving it to me. He shook his head. He was not giving it to me. He simply wanted me to see that he had earned it. I looked at the envelope. I did not open it. Then he asked whether I thought he was finally becoming someone. I looked at my son. "You were always someone. You just spent a long time trying to become someone else." There was no hug, no apology that erased 36 years, no promise that everything between us would suddenly become easy. Evan went back to work. I went back to arranging flowers. But something had changed. For the first time, we were standing in the same room without money sitting between us. The past had not disappeared, but he was finally learning how to build something that belonged to him, and I was finally learning how to love him without building the floor underneath every step. For 36 years, I thought loving my son meant making sure he never fell. I finally learned that sometimes love means stepping back far enough for him to discover that he can stand.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in? And what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.